All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know there's some folks still getting coffee, but in the essence of time, we'll kick it off. This breakout panel is titled The Evolution of Information Sharing, Using Technology, Policy, and Standardization to Turn Data into Business Assets. As I'm sure you're all well aware, in all the discussions we've had, information sharing and collaboration is a critical piece to success in a lot of the initiatives and work that we're doing. And this is one of the topics that inevitably, regardless of what the overall meeting is about, always is requested as one of the key topics we focus on. So what we've done today is pull together some various speakers who come from different information sharing programs, initiatives, and have different backgrounds to give some thoughts and ideas to various elements of information sharing. I'll go ahead and give a brief introduction of each one, and we'll get started. To my far left is Ms. Patty Craighill, the Special Advisor to the Chief Warfighting and Integration at NextGen JPDO. Ms. Patricia Craighill is a member of the Senior Executive Service, Senior Level High Qualified Expert Program, is Special Advisor Air Traffic Services to the Chief of Warfighting Integration and CIO, Office of the Secretary of the Air Force in D.C. Ms. Craighill represents the Air Force as Executive Agent for the Department of Defense, serving as the Assistant Director of Defense Joint Planning and Development Office, the organization responsible for development of the Next Generation Air Transportation System. All the way to my right is Mary Forbes, who is the Chief Enterprise Architect at Health and Human Services. Mary has served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Public Health Service for 30 years, with over 25 years at the FDA, focusing on health, information management, and systems development. She was the first program manager and chief enterprise architect for the Federal Health Architecture and currently serves as the HHS chief architect. To my right is David Lewis, CTO for the nationwide SAR initiative at Justice. Mr. Lewis is the senior policy advisor for the Bureau of Justice Assistance and is responsible for justice information sharing projects, such as the Regional Information Sharing Systems and support for fusion centers and the National Criminal Intelligence Resource Center. In early 2010, Mr. Lewis was named CTO to the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative, otherwise known as SAR, where he is responsible for the technical aspects of implementing SAR throughout fusion centers nationwide. To my left is Dermot O'Mahony, excuse me, it says O'Malley here. O'Mahony, who is the Vice President of LexisNexis Government, responsible for strategic marketing and product development. He has over 10 years' experience identifying high potential market opportunities and then aligning the appropriate business and technology resources to meet those opportunities. He specializes in use of open source data and large-scale data processing technologies and leveraging them to provide solutions to meet the needs of LexisNexis clients. And last but definitely not least is Wolf Toombe, the CTO for the Customs and Border Protection. As the CTO at CBP, Wolf holds responsibility for the agency's information transformation initiatives, which includes the CBP Enterprise Technical Architecture, compromising technology, data, applications, security, and service architectures. Wolf chairs both the SOA and Application Working Group and the Technology Review Committee, where he provides leadership on technology planning, architecture, standards, and the adoption of industry best practices. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today, and we know you're very busy, so it means a lot that you're here. I wanted just to frame the conversation so everyone knows exactly what it is you work on and kind of what information sharing initiatives you do. I wanted to start over with Mary and work our way down and have you all give a brief high-level overview of the information sharing activities that you do, what the stakeholders are, and kind of where you're at in the life cycle of your initiative.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Actually, I wanted to emphasize the evolution part of our title here, because historically HHS has done a number of information exchanges with state, tribal, local partners in order to achieve our mission. Some of those examples would be the work that we did with HIPAA in terms of being able to exchange health information, and also the Public Health Information Network at CDC and a number of other activities. In 2004, we were challenged by the Health IT initiation and the challenge from the President to, within 10 years, be able to exchange electronic health records essentially across the country. So that's a really big information exchange kind of an activity to be involved in. And within the last couple of years, HHS has also realized that in order to achieve some of these goals and to help support the mission execution, we need to look at partnering with NEAM, and so HHS joined the NEAM Executive Steering Committee, and we are now engaged in development in two major domains, one for health and one for human services. And then the continuum really goes beyond that to reach over into the data dissemination arena, and this is where we start talking about actually sharing our information very broadly through semantic web and some of those kind of activities, and a lot of the work that's done out on data.gov. Because if we're really going to affect the health of the nation, we need to get people in a position to use the information that's out there to actually improve their health themselves and take control over their health.
Interesting. Thank you. David?
Yes. First of all, I know you have a lot of acronyms out there, and NSI, I think, has gone to the next level. It's an acronym within an acronym. So it's a nationwide SAR, which stands Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. And if you don't get anything else out of that, just remember NSI, and just feel safe that that acronym is certified with the FOA. That's the Federal Office of Acronyms. And I made that up, folks, so don't go look for it on the internet. First time I did that, I had 30 emails the next day that they were, so. But in the nationwide SAR initiative, really came out after 9/11 with all the failures that we saw that were highlighted in the 9/11 report, the Intelligence Reform Act, and then we had, actually the NSI office came from the White House memo creating this particular project. And what it is, it's the sharing of suspicious activity reports that have the potential nexus to terrorism. I mean, our biggest problem, I think, that why we got involved more than anything else, is there are 72 recognized fusion centers out there that represent 15,000 law enforcement agencies. And every one of them have their own little way that they share information. They're all law enforcement, as opposed to many other disciplines, is very, very protective of their information, because one piece of information can make or break a case. So we really had to go out there and look at how to share information without changing the way that they did business today. Law enforcement, and I spent 26 years in law enforcement, street officer, worked my way up, did anything and everything in the field, turned my gun in for a computer and never looked back. But the interesting part about that is that it gets very difficult because we have had, we'll talk about it a little bit later, successes and failures when it comes about pushing information to be held someplace else, especially when it's law enforcement information. So getting that, 72 fusion centers connected, and we've just recently I had a very interesting discussion that came out of the White House saying that they want all 72 fusion centers connected by 9/11/11. So hopefully I will still have a job after that date. But that's basically the idea behind our project, and we've built it on some very successful architectures or examples that we've used previously in distributed modeling. Some of you may have either used or have heard about the National Sex Offender Public Registry. We built that, the team I was working on built that in 1 year, connecting 53 disparate databases using the open internet built it in 1 year for less than $1 million. Now, they never let that out there because that's one of the best kept secrets, I think, more than anything else. We're also building the law enforcement search tool for the National Motor Vehicle Title Information Sharing System, which allows title information when it comes to cloning and title washing to be shared with law enforcement. It's not law enforcement's data. We usually don't work with departments and bureaus of motor vehicle, but we use the data. So we have a lot of successes on as a foundation, but that's where basically what we base the NSI on right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Dermot?
Sure. So my name is Dermot Romani. I work for LexisNexis. Lexis is probably the world's largest commercial aggregator of open source information. By open source, within this context, is basically any information that can be bought by a commercial entity. We will go out and acquire this content, whether from governments and state, local, and federal organizations, or from commercial entities who make that information available to us. What we do at that then is we bring it in, we clean it, standardize it, and make it available for search and query by our government customers, folks such as yourselves. Historically, this business started back in the late 80s, early 90s, and at this point is pretty much almost considered a regulated industry. It's very difficult for folks to gain access to the information unless they really have a need to know. My background, taking this kind of, when you're an aggregator, every piece of information needs to be aggregated. And so back in the early 2000s, we got involved in some law enforcement information sharing projects that were run at the state level. We learned some very interesting lessons about that, and I think that we're going to discuss a little bit later. David was involved with on the other side. But what we found was really that gathering data and the technology solutions to gather data is a relatively trivial process. The difficult part, and the part I think that there's a lot of discussion with here, is working out who should have access to that data from a policy perspective, why they should have access to the data, and then putting the information technology controls in place to be able to regulate that. And so I think it'd be a very interesting discussion when we go down that path.
Awesome. Wolf?
Similarly, from a technology perspective, we've come great strides with taking some of our legacy closed systems and opening those by exposing a SOA framework that is technology agnostic and open standards compliant. We've also adopted NEAM conformance as mandatory as a part of that framework, and we work really closely across all the components within the department and even the ISE at the White House level to ensure that we're adopting standards and ways to share information. I think more importantly than the technology, though, is to recognize that from specifically a homeland security perspective, and CBP being one of the nation's largest, actually the nation's largest law enforcement organization, is culturally, we have taken the mission space from a model 8 years ago that was restrict by default, share by exception, and we completely flipped that model to share by default, restrict by exception, and there's a gigantic cultural transformation that has to occur to make that happen. So while the IT part is there, we have to work very closely with the mission spaces on exactly the issues mentioned. So I was also a ECOP and a patrol deputy sheriff in my previous life, and so a lot of that is working with the mission space saying, look, I understand the need to protect this data. I understand the law enforcement sensitivity. Here's how we can put appropriate controls in place so that data can be shared with first responders, state and local, and other agencies, and give you the assurance you need to know that it's protected.
Wonderful. And Patty?
So I'm in the Joint Planning and Development Office, JPDO, for Next Gen, and this is FAA's Next Gen, not Navy's Next Gen, not somebody else's Next Gen. There's lots of Next Gens. Our program is looking at the future of the national airspace and all of the related systems and what they could be, applying technology and important research and development out to the year 2025 and actually beyond that. So what do the skies look like? If you're old like me, you remember the Jetsons and how they flew. Yeah, right. Without pilots. That's certainly going to be possible in the future of Next Gen. So in our office was chartered in 2003 to help FAA bring the technology research from the 5 partner agencies to bear and to help them apply technology and make sure that we're reaching all of the different constituencies and taking advantage of what's available, and also the private sector. So 5 agencies, Department of Homeland Security, Commerce, in particular the Weather Service, NASA, DOD, and FAA, Department of Transportation. In DOD, the Air Force is the lead service, and we have an office on the air staff in A3 who is responsible for being the DOD voice to Next Gen. That's not my job. I was brought in 2 years ago to work on the net-centric underpinnings of the interagency information sharing environment. So we're not an acquisition arm, but we are there to facilitate and encourage net-centric behavior. So how do you do that? We looked at success stories across the government and private sector in implementing services-oriented architecture and determined that the best way to have a successful implementation is to take some small examples and demonstrate the capability and show the benefits of information sharing, and then the partners will bring the data and other data that they want to get their hands on. So we're taking small slivers of the architecture and drilling all the way through business process to building vocabularies and ultimately building web services to demonstrate the beauty of sharing information between the agencies. And our problem is similar to those that have already been talked about and exacerbated by the breadth of data security requirements, every level of DoD security, law enforcement data, privacy data, commercial proprietary data, and a new category I learned this week called privileged data. So there's a lot of complexity to how we could share this and what the policy should be around that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. Can I quickly ask one of my staff, can you guys bring a couple of pitchers of water up here? I think we're going to be thirsty up here. I know we have one, but I think we need another one. Thank you. I don't want you getting coughing up here. So we have many questions to get through and limited time, so we're going to try to get through these as best as possible. If we can work on being as terse as possible, it would be awesome. I want to get through some issues on technology, policy governance, some trends, security, and then federal and state information sharing. So first up, Wolf. I have a few questions here that I came up during research related to standards, and I was wondering, specific to open standards, what your views are on that, and what steps the DHS and/or CBP is taking to facilitate info sharing based on open standards, seeing as how it is kind of a controversial thing depending on who you're talking to.
Well, we've actually are moving OIT strictly to an open standards, open architecture approach.
Thank you.
We've actually taken that to the next step where we're working with our application shops to create a single application architecture that for the first time in CBP, all of them will be coding to work so that there can be reuse within the application shops and across the application shops. And all of that, again, is open standards based. So we are fully moving towards that. It is a requirement for us. We're actually working with some of our industry partners who are, well, shall we say, less than completely open standards based, and pointing out to them that as an $11 billion annual budgeted organization, it would be well worth their whiles to become open standards place if they'd like to remain a strategic vendor. So we're leveraging that kind of capability to push that across our vendor community.
Interesting. Anyone else have any comments on open standards, the work you're doing there? All right. And obviously, panelists, feel free to jump in on each other's comments. David, next up, you were talking about the work you do at NSI, and I understand that it's built on a distributed model where information is hosted locally but shared using national standards. So I was wondering why this approach was taken and what's the benefits of using this model.
As I mentioned, we had the multiple different fusion centers, and we always hear time and time again, don't reinvent the wheel. By having all these different people out there, we knew identity management was going to be an issue. We knew that they had to be able to use secure but unclassified networks that worked for them. And then that we had to have some kind of search capability. We've got a lot of pushback of individual sites that didn't want to push their information to a central repository. So we came up with this architecture using the term they call it shared spaces, where we actually put a server in between their local legacy system or however they're collecting their data, and then we do the federated search on the other side. So kind of like building a tunnel through a mountain. We start at two ends and hopefully it meets in the middle. Thank God it does. But what we do is actually, because there are so many different ways that they hold their data, we had a national subject matter expert group that created a SAR IEPD, an Information Exchange Packet document, that we have all the elements in there that we want to share in a SAR. So basically what they do is, that's what the whole box actually does in the middle. So they can use anything they want on their side, and they write one-to-one. We can use our federated search to the other side and rewrite one-to-many. And one of the reasons that we kind of picked this particular architecture is it's secure, it's economical, and it allows for that local control. Now, the interesting part about it is if, say, there are 220 elements in the SAR IEPD, they can only share 125, either based by law or by policy. Well, if I have to maintain a one-to-one connection, if they change anything on their side, I have to go back and rebuild that connection with them. By them doing that, and when they populate their box, if they had a change on Tuesday, and they repopulated their box based on their one-to-one, I would never have to change anything on the federated search, because we always ask for all the data elements. And then we only bring back what's actually is available in the box. So we got a lot of good support by building this architecture, and we also said we wanted to build an architecture that had life after SAR. So what we're also doing by having these boxes in place, they're only about 30% capacity, 30% capacity. We have identified other projects that can use the same box in a partition. One of them sharing terrorist screening center information, and the next one sharing gang information. So we picked this particular architecture based on the wants and needs of the field, not what we'd like to see in the federal government.
That makes sense. Patty, we just heard David talk about kind of the model that he's using. And I know that's in your particular instance, based on the call we had a couple weeks ago, I was wondering how you're addressing the problems of interagency information exchange, given the fact that a lot of the agencies you work with are adopting disparate data models. I think that's something you were talking about earlier.
Yes, we're taking a make it easy on everybody approach for the near term, and basically allowing folks to come with whatever model, whatever schemas they have, and building ontologies, and we talked about ontology today, in order to provide the translation between the systems. And we kind of anticipate that there'll be a coming together of some of the communities that right now think they have different lexicons and need to have different lexicons, but I think that some of that will iron out in the process of building the ontologies. But on the other hand, there are some that by necessity need to have their own way of expressing and searching. So they'll be able to access our registries for looking for data and looking for services from their own environment and not have to understand everybody else's schemas. So we have a registry built, and we're in the process of building the ontology.
Great. Moving on to another important issue, which is policies and governance. And as we mentioned earlier, the purpose of one of the main takeaways from this panel should be how to use information sharing to deliver, to turn data into a business asset. And Mary, I was wondering, I know you guys are doing a lot of work on that over at HHS, and what policies, governance, and process and tools are you guys using to really help facilitate that over at HHS and the other folks you work with? Okay.
I talked about our work with the health domain, and actually that's one area where we have made quite a bit of progress in the governance area, because we now have an executive steering committee that crosses the entire HHS organization and brings in representatives from the various stakeholders across HHS who have something to do with health. So that's a lot of people and a big portion of the organization. This group is chaired by the Office of the National Coordinator, the National Coordinator for Health IT, and by Todd Park, who is the Chief Technology Officer for HHS. And then there are representatives from these various organizations. And this group is charged with looking at information as an enterprise asset, health information, across the organization, and ensuring that sharing is the default, as we heard earlier. This is huge for HHS. HHS has some very large components who historically have not always worked together that well. It really has a lot of impact on our stakeholders because we do exchange so much information with state, local, and tribal partners in addition to a number of public partners. And so the more we can standardize the way we're exchanging this information, we realize it's going to help us to achieve our mission goals. We also are leveraging grants, which one of the ways that we do much of our work in both health and human services is through grants to states in particular. And a lot of the ways grants have been used in the past has not always worked to the benefit of the states as much as it could because there were so many restrictions on how they could use the grants and what they could use the grants to build and whether those services could be shared by other components and what kind of funding they got if they did that. It's still kind of a mess, but we're trying to work our way through that so that we really can use the dollars that we're sending out to the states to help advance their position and our position, and in the end save the taxpayers a lot of money. Internally, we have an enterprise performance life cycle that we use for IT projects within HHS, and this is a series of stage gates that go throughout the life of a project from concept through retirement. And architecture and various players chime in at these various stage gates so that we can look to see that standards are being addressed throughout the life cycle of those projects.
Cool. I know, Patty, I know that also you'd also mentioned a lot of policy challenges you were facing at NextGen. I was wondering if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem for us because each agency is working their own information sharing policy within the agency. But when you look at an outfit like FAA, who is sharing a lot of their information with the general public and the commercial carriers, they have about more than 300 MOUs with individual organizations for information sharing or information exchanges. So they started to look at that and said, this is crazy, it's really a headache to try to manage these and know whether or not they have duplication and what the terms are of each one of those MOUs. So they asked us to engage with them to try to figure that out. It's further complicated by the consideration of some of their data is used commercially and resold. So what happens to that if the data becomes widely available? What happens to the business model for those companies? If it's not, if it's restricted, who is allowed to have it and who can charge for it? And in fact, if it costs FAA a considerable amount of money to make it available in a certain way that somebody's looking for it, does it make sense for them to be able to charge for that, or should they charge for it because they don't really have the budget to make those changes? So there's a lot of business model kind of considerations about their ownership of data, and then marry that with the other agencies who have restrictions for privacy purposes or law enforcement purposes. It's pretty complicated. So what we're doing is putting together a committee to begin to peel back that onion and figure out what we can do about it. And my goal is to address the policy issues using the ontology and the architecture. So attach the restrictions to the data and follow that through the system and create the access control understanding the roles and attributes for access control, and then use the business rules in the system to manage that instead of doing it through a bunch of paperwork.
Great, interesting. Shifting gears a little bit here, we had made the joke earlier about all the acronyms that we have. But David, I know that we had talked about the fact that the NSI was originally called a project and later became a program. And I was wondering, how does that happen? Why did that happen? What does that really mean?
Yeah, I found out how that happens real quick. The way it started out was this was a pure technology project. I'm a technologist, and I would love to say it's a 100% technology project. And there were 3 state fusion centers that said, you know what, we have this information, we've been asked, how should we share it? Well, we did our last, it was New York, Virginia, and Florida. And we did our last field visit in Florida, and I think at a sunset, sitting under an umbrella with maybe some adult beverages, that somebody said, this could be expanded real easy. And then it became 12 locations, including 9 major cities. And then what we did is it became what we called the evaluation environment. The technology wasn't the problem. But we found out very quickly that there were a lot of issues about some of this information had a lot of personal identifying information. It had a lot of privacy issues, which the ACLU and the Civil Libertarians said on some other projects have reviewed and showed their interest in it. So we quickly agreed that privacy became one of the issues. Well, then we had we had technology and privacy. Then we had to figure out how do we train 850,000 law enforcement officers on what a SAR is and who they should report it to. But what we also identified a need was executive buy-in. You could build the best project, you could have the best product in the world, but if you don't have that executive buy-in, you're not getting it in the door. So now the training included an executive buy-in and then a field officer buy-in. But then we had to identify, because there's a very high vetting requirement in here, to make sure that it meets the standards of the functional standard as well as it meets the privacy concerns. So we created an 8-hour analyst training that we call our gatekeepers. So analysts have the final vetting before it gets into this federated search. And that 8 hours is identifiers. And the biggest thing I could tell you more than anything else, this is not a system built on people. It's a system built on behaviors. So taking photographs is not illegal. If it was, we would have a dossier on everybody that ever visited Washington, D.C., because they take pictures of everything. So, but what we found out was that, if you had a yellow pickup truck taking photographs at a chemical plant at 4 a.m. in the morning, that would be suspicious activity based on totality of the circumstances. So we had to build all that into the educational process. We did the very first field officer training for the inauguration. We had 4,000 police officers came into Washington, D.C. from outside of the district, and we had them do this training. It was 2-hour training, provided it, went great, and we asked for their feedback. And their feedback was too long. Now, I already have a lot of basics. I do this every day. So in the infinite wisdom of the federal government, we retooled it and made it a 4-hour training. So basically what we actually did is we brought it down to a DVD level, 2 7.5-minute segments that could be used at roll call, could be used at trainings, it could be used at the academy, it could be used at, however the department want to do it, statewide training networks. So we have this goal of training 850,000 law enforcement officers over the next year. So we put all those pieces together, not what I really am extremely good at. I'm good at technology, but we picked the right people and went forward.
Cool, thanks. Changing gears here a bit, I want to talk about some trends. One in particular is cloud computing, and I wrote this one down. I don't like reading things like this, but I have to because Dermot said something on our call that was really interesting. He mentioned that most information sharing initiatives today involve federated searching of distributed information sources, which allow data holders to continue to have control of the data. Of course, now we're moving towards cloud environments, especially enterprise data clouds. I was wondering, is this going to change, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one of the things we've been looking at is what effect cloud computing and the consolidation of data sources will have on how people look at information. Historically, I think for both privacy reasons and data ownership reasons, the federated approach to information sharing has really been the de facto one adopted by government. And that made a lot of sense, and it still makes a lot of sense. And as we saw this morning on the keynote address, it's getting far more sophisticated with the applications of ontologies and semantic search of that information. What's interesting in the trends we're seeing is that that approach is very much based upon what I like to call a privacy by isolation. The data is stored in the original sources, and although people tie the information records together through federated searching, the concept or the precept is that privacy is in place and the security is still there because I own my data. It's very much a physical manifest, and that's very true in law enforcement, as we discussed earlier, where law enforcement officers and agencies really don't like letting their data loose. But what we're seeing, just as we discussed in a number of the other sessions, is that right now clouds are very much like their real-life namesake. They're very fluffy, nebulous, and nobody's quite sure, what they are, and depending on which way you look at it, it's always different to someone else. But I think what we will see is that the information is going to start getting consolidated on virtual environments. Right? The nature, we're starting off easily with things like emails, and we're talking about internal process. But I think as people get more comfortable with the idea of the data being outside of their own personal data center, it's going to open up an entire Pandora's box of discussion of, now that you have the data again in a place where it can be analyzed across itself. So you can look at every record in one database and compare it to every record in another database and correlate that information very easily because the information is in the same virtual environment. The question is as a group of technologists and then as a group of policy writers, do we wish to open that lid and create new business applications on top of this new facility that we have in place? And I think the discussions on federation have got to the point where we're really at the fine line of deciding exactly the end game in that, just in time for this new technological shift to occur, which I think is going to open everything up again.
Cool. This next question I want to direct at Wolf, and then hopefully get some other panelists to chime in on, because I think it's really important. And that's about emerging trends and embracing emerging trends. And I'm wondering how you think CBP or DHS can do this to help improve operational efficiencies and ultimately facilitate better and wider information sharing.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and for us in CBP, for a number of reasons, emerging technologies and emerging best practices is not a nice to have, it's an essential to have. We actually have to stay in front. Number one, because the Office of IT has undergone a couple of fairly significant budget cuts the last 2 years to support the mission spaces and their hiring of agents and officers, which is the right thing to do. But that has forced us to take to heart that we need to do more with less and that we need to promote efficiencies internally as well as within the mission spaces. And number two, because the threat is constantly evolving. So whether it's nation-state sponsored terrorism or it's the Mexican drug cartel, they're using advanced technologies. They're not sitting still. That means we have to counter that with the same capabilities. So what we have done is we work closely with our EA shop on the business architecture to understand the mission needs, and then we partner with industry and with the private corporations to understand what best practices they're adopting as well as other large federal agencies. We take all that and we create a 4-year technology roadmap where we monitor all emerging technologies across the spectrum if it has a business implication for us. So we rate all those technologies by the potential value to the organization and the potential risk to implementation. And then we work to make a fact-based decision on when is the appropriate time to incorporate that. And we have a pretty good understanding of what expectation on value we intend to get out of it and the costs and the time frames to do so. Great.
And I really like the fact that you, I think you said, emerging trends are not a nice-to-have, it's a must-to-have. I think that's a really great approach. I think that anyone who doesn't do that is ultimately going to face it anyway, right? You may as well bite the bullet as soon as possible. Anyone else? I know Mary probably has some cool... Oh, David?
I just want to tell you real quick is because we're dealing with people in the field, and things change so quick that we're looking at reporting using handheld devices to come into the fusion centers to allow them to do immediate response of people that field officers are dealing with. Also, a better use of identity management because we have cross disciplines in there, so we can parse out information based on what your rules and attributions are on your identity. And finally, to do bundled searches. In other words, as we start to search across databases, if I don't, in my first search I don't get, or I get a VIN number that I didn't have before, that it automatically goes back and searches databases that have VIN numbers, and we're trying to link those together, and actually the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Department of Justice is going to be funding some bundled search research over, not research, but fund some pilot projects, hopefully over this next year.
Interesting. And Mary, what about at HHS? What's
Okay, well, one of the really exciting things we've been working in is in the area of linked data. And if you go out to healthdata.gov, you can see some examples of some of the work that we've been doing there with the hospital compare data set and some other kinds of comparison tools that will be available as we're moving forward. The CMS, one of our components, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, does quite a bit of work in terms of monitoring the quality of care that's delivered, which I hope you're happy to hear as taxpayers. And so they have a large number of data sets that are very rich, and some of these have already been available, but now we're adding the power of linked data and that kind of an approach, and using the Sparkle and some of the tools that we heard about in the address this morning. George Thomas, who has been here a number of times in the past, is our lead for this activity, and he's also the co-chair of a new group within W3C, which is it's a linked data working group, and he's one of the co-leads on that activity. So we're very excited about that as we move forward to really address some of these issues that we have of having all of these disparate data repositories and then being able to bring that data together when we need to, rather than trying to come up with these huge data warehouses.
terrific? Thank you. Moving on to another very critical component of information sharing, which is security. I just, before lunch, moderated a panel on privacy, and I understand that LexisNexis has one of the largest I think repositories of personal information out there. I'm wondering what LexisNexis is doing to protect this, given all the information sharing that you're involved with.
Yeah, sure. LexisNexis is one of the largest repositories of people information in the world, definitely the United States. And as you can imagine, there's certain entities out there, particularly involved in identity theft and things like that, who would be very, very interested in gaining access to the information. Now, what we found is, and I think this will become more prevalent in your community, as folks outside of your inner security or inner circle of trust start getting access to information. So it's very easy. The gentleman last night from SCIC, I believe he used the term that he imposed martial law on his enterprise and just control access to information sources. They could control access to how the information was accessed. You could control when, what, and where. Unfortunately, as a commercial entity, it's very hard to impose martial law on your customer base, especially when your customer base is you guys. So you sort of have to take a different approach. And obviously, we have a lot of physical and logical security in place, and I won't get into that. But what we found to be very useful is that the weakest element in any security link is really the user. You can control the machine, you can control the network, but you can't control the person who's misusing the access to the information. Right? Someone walks in the morning, decides they want to look up where their ex-girlfriend is today, or they're trying to find where their ex-husband is, and that becomes difficult because they do have access rights to the system, but they're misusing the information. And I think there was the incident with Bradley Manning in regards to the WikiLeaks thing, which is sort of an example of that in the governmental space. What Lexis has done is very much a trend analysis type approach to this higher level of security, in that people normally access systems in certain ways, right? They're going to access a system. If you're a law enforcement officer, you're probably going to be coming in, accessing the system, looking for someone's name or their address or possibly a telephone number, and they access the system in a relatively regular way. If all of a sudden you start seeing a spike in usage, or you start seeing different ways of people accessing the information, at that point, the automated systems really need to flag in, or need to hook in, flag that, hey, there might be something wrong here, and then to take remedial action from a personnel perspective. It gets very, very difficult to control access to information once people that you don't know and you don't really have a lot of say over start being able to access your computer systems.
Absolutely. Patty, what about you with regards to airspace? Obviously, that's something I think security is quite important when we're up in the air.
Well, it is, and You know, in the past, the approach at FAA in particular was we're securing the network and nobody gets into our network and therefore it's secure. And we all understand that if you assume that, then you're probably already in trouble because you're being penetrated. So in the JPDO, we have not a lot of resources to focus on this. So we looked at what can we focus our small resources on that will make a difference in the interagency world. Each agency is addressing security issues on their own, and what we decided was there's a lot of strength in each of the agencies, but they don't know about what each other is doing, and so we're doing information sharing on information sharing, and we're holding a monthly forum to allow the agencies to share their concerns and also their successes in this area. And it's brought to light, for example, the system that will enable a lot of the future capabilities of NextGen is called ADSB, Automated Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. We all struggle with what that means. It's basically GPS-based navigation, so you know at any point in time where an aircraft is in the air pretty exactly. And the IG at Department of Transportation raised the question about whether this system is secure, which raised interest on the part of DoD, and all of that trickled down. So we posed the question to the program office, and we've had now a series of meetings with them talking about what about the system is secure, what isn't secure. And it turns out a lot of it, we're getting to the bottom of, is that FAA's terminology is focused on safety and not security. So they're doing a lot of they're using a lot of the measures that we would use in the security world, but they don't call them security. So we're having a translation problem here. So that's just an example of what's come out of this forum. But we've had great discussions and a lot of folks coming to the meeting. We get more and more people each month when we do that. So that's a positive thing with very few resources we've been able to do. And then we decided what can we actually tackle as a problem to solve. And the first big issue for us, we believe in the interagency world, is identity, credentialing, and access management. So you've heard Ken talk already about that, and we're putting together a conference in June to bring together the folks who care about that in each one of the agencies. And as he may have said yesterday, a kid that we're going to put them in a room, lock the door, and shove pizza under the door until they come up with a solution. So hopefully we'll make some progress next month on that.
Wonderful. All right. I had one more question I want to get to, but I'm getting the cut it off phase. It really was about the Matrix program that was an information sharing at the state level, which I know David and Dermot were both a part of, and I believe it was kind of pulled up because of privacy concerns, and obviously they've overcome it. Can you guys, in literally 30 seconds, each kind of tell what you're involved with and why it's working now?
Well, I mentioned before the importance of privacy. Basically, it's probably one of the best search engines across private and public data. They collated, could bring together a nice report. We learned both for documentation, privacy, and who's doing what in the system. So our audit trails are, if somebody hiccups while they're on the system, I can tell you that.
Yeah, so I came from the other side. I helped build the Matrix product. I was the chief architect on it at the time. And I guess the approach we took was the techies gone wild approach to information sharing. We didn't have any lawyers. I don't believe we understood the concept of having a chief privacy officer. We were writing code and trying to solve customer problems by tying all this information together. Unfortunately, there was a sort of a naive approach to something that became as sensitive as information sharing, and at that time we didn't really understand it. But we've altered the technology, and I believe that there was probably a pretty good learning experience for the entire community, and hopefully you guys have learned a lot from that over time.
And the biggest thing was its central repository versus distributed modeling. When you're sending state data across state lines to be housed someplace else, governors get a little itchy. So that's the biggest thing I think we learned from that.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I hate to cut off a great discussion, but we are out of time. Panelists, thank you very much.